Hey, what's up? It's Mr. Dean, and The Legend of Zelda has always been one of those franchises that I've wanted to get into, but I just never have for some reason. I played Breath of the Wild whenever the Switch first released, and with that being basically the only game available on the Switch at launch, I actually beat it and loved it. I also played through the remake of Link's Awakening on the Switch, and once again, I love that too. Aside from that though, well, that's about it. I played a little bit of Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Wind Waker, but I think back whenever I was younger, I just never really got around to playing through them. So today I wanted to begin my journey of documenting my playthrough of the Legend of Zelda series game by game. This is no doubt going to be a very long trek ahead of me due to how many games there are and how expansive some of them end up getting, but with how prevalent of a series this is, it's about time I do this. And what better way to start this than the game that started it all, The Legend of Zelda for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now to be fair, I was already somewhat familiar with the workings and history of this game. I mean, I feel like it's kind of difficult to be a Nintendo fan and not know at least some part of this game's impact. The game was originally developed with Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka at the helm, specifically with Miyamoto being in charge of the game itself and Tezuka leading the script and story. Originally, this game was being developed at the same time as the original Super Mario Bros. Game, however what's interesting is how they were in a way foils to one another. Super Mario Bros. Was a linear platformer. Each level you played through was strictly laid out for you, with the challenge coming from completing whatever the platforming course ahead of you was. Conversely, Zelda was a full-on adventure, giving the player complete leeway into how they went about their journey. Miyamoto also stated that much of the inspiration for Zelda came from growing up around Kyoto, where he would explore the environments around him. Sure, originally the 8-bit hardware may not have been able to properly replicate this idea visually, the gameplay really brought about that aspect of his childhood. That is the basic backstory of the game. I think it's easier to talk more about this game's impact after talking about the game itself, so with that, let's play The Legend of Zelda for the NES. Now, one thing that is very important to keep in mind when playing this game, especially in the 21st century, is that playing with a manual is strongly encouraged. Even if you are like me and not playing this on the original hardware, you can easily find a manual online in order to try to replicate the original experience. Generally speaking, you are able to complete this game in any manner that you want. It is completely an open world adventure. In theory, you can just stumble into one of the latter dungeons, although more than likely you wouldn't be getting very far in them. And with that being said, the game does not hold your hand at all. When you load the game up, you spawn with absolutely nothing and all you see is an opening in the mountain, so naturally the player walks in there. Doing that grants you a sword, this giving you the ability to traverse the overworld and fight whatever enemies lie in your path. The game does not give you any indication of where to go or what to do, and that is certainly less evident if you are not looking at a manual or anything. In some ways, this is really cool since it creates this sense of freedom with the player as they can literally do whatever they want. Oh, so you want to die like 7 times to these same dumbass enemies? Well, be my guest. Now on the other hand of the same coin, without a guide or walkthrough, there can certainly be moments where the player can feel clueless. I remember watching Scott the Waz's video about this game and he did a really good job describing this issue. He equated following a guide to being almost like following a treasure map, which I completely agree with. Even with following a guide, this game is still very difficult, so it doesn't really take the fun out of it in my opinion. And besides, there are so many parts of this game that feel overly cryptic. For example, at one part you may need to burn down a random bush in order to proceed with literally zero indication of doing so. If you are not playing with a guide, this becomes extremely frustrating to deal with. If these were more creatively designed around puzzles or had obtainable clues for them, I think it'd be really cool to have secrets like this, but in its current form, it's kind of obnoxious. I want to reiterate that I am in no way dissing the quality of the game itself. When playing with a guide, it's a lot of fun. This is just something that I observed. Alright, plot time. This is my first time covering a Zelda game on the channel, and this is only the 3rd game I've played, so my knowledge on the overarching lore is somewhat limited. I know there is a whole timeline with diverging paths between the games, and I admittedly am not super keen on that whole thing. To give you the basic gist though, Ganon is our no-good bad guy. He wants to do his evil villain bullshit, and we as Link go not so fast. Basically, he steals the Triforce of Power, which is an artifact that gives great, well, power. So now panic rests upon Hyrule, and in order to protect the land, Princess Zelda splits the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 pieces and spreads them across the 8 dungeons in the game. For an open world adventure game in 1986, I think this is a really cool fantasy style plot. I can totally imagine being a kid in the 80s and being completely immersed in trying to save the day. Other adventure games that came before lacked the gameplay depth that this game also introduced. As well as the gameplay depth, little things like the iconic soundtrack and incredibly well designed visuals really helped to sell the innovation of the game. Look no further than the coloring of the different areas of the overworld. There are clearly different environments, whether you are in the grasslands, the rocky desert looking terrain, or the graveyard. It is clear if the area you are in is hilly and mountainous or completely flattened by the ocean. The fact that this level of visual fidelity was pulled off on the 8-bit NES is certainly impressive. Alright, so you start the game off with your sword, which whenever you have full health emits a sort of magical blast across the screen. This, especially in the early game, was extremely vital to taking out certain enemies from a distance. Whenever you first get started out, survival is a lot more difficult since you have less items and less health, so you have to be way more careful. As you progress through the game, you gain the ability to obtain different items, some being collected in the various dungeons and others being bought with rupees. And you get rupees through little secrets in the overworld, which, as I noted earlier, are often very cryptic and bizarre. You can also get rupees by taking out every single enemy that you see, which, sorry, but it's pretty satisfying to just swing your sword all over the place on these enemies. Speaking of the enemies, do they make me feel like a loser. Some of them are pretty straightforward to deal with, but others just really wanted to get on my bad side. Many of them have patterns that the player has to kind of figure out, and once you do, it becomes so satisfying since they feel like less of a threat going forward. And once again, once you get towards the end of the game, you have a plethora of health and items, so you suddenly become significantly more confident when taking on enemies and bosses. For the items that you get on your journey, we got some pretty fun ones. One of them is the bombs, which you start out with only being able to hold 8, but some of the dungeons allow us to raise that limit. You place them down and let them go BOOM on the enemies, and it's so awesome. These are also imperative to getting to certain areas via blasting random holes on the wall too. There is also this magical wand thing which can shoot range attacks at enemies. We got some health stuff, which is fun if you lose health a lot. I obviously cannot relate, just kidding, yes I can. As I mentioned, there are 9 different dungeons for us to complete along the quest, which these were easily the most fun part of the game. This is because the puzzles felt more fun and compelling to solve, and towards the end of the game they get very difficult. Like, some of the rooms just throw a gauntlet full of enemies at you, which gets about as stressful as you can imagine. I also think it's pretty cool how some of the little underground areas in the dungeons also mimic a 2D platformer with the point of view. It obviously isn't a platformer, but it's kinda cute how all of a sudden the perspective temporarily changes. And also, each of the dungeons are shaped like a specific animal or thing. For example, level 1 is called the Eagle, and it kinda sorta looks like an eagle. The final dungeon in the game is Death Mountain, which is this super long gauntlet of a puzzle filled with elaborate paths and Eventually we run into Ganon after all this, and weirdly this final fight was kind of easier than the whole dungeon that preceded it. Like, first he just kind of disappears and shoots fireballs at you, but I just randomly swung my sword around and next thing I knew he was dead. I love how in the next room whenever we rescue Zelda she just goes like, "Thank you, Link." That's it. They punctuated this with periods too. I just love to imagine Zelda saying all this with the most emotionless voice ever. Now, with everything that I've said, the real important thing about this game isn't the game itself, it's the impact that the game has had. Like I said earlier in the video, this was not the first adventure game ever made, but it sure as hell changed the genre. It's kind of beautiful how in a way Breath of the Wild 30 years later feels like the concept for this game fully realized. Maybe not in the sense of it being the same kind of Zelda game, but whenever it comes to being fully open world and giving the player full control, these two games have that same strand of DNA in common. And I unfortunately have not really played any of the other Zelda games in the series, and there are a good handful of them, so I am really excited to take a look at those and see how they stack up with the others. I know this was a pretty short video, so thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed, and as always, peace out.